Well, hello everyone. What a group. My goodness. I was just sharing earlier with one of your board members that this is kind of overwhelming because in Orlando we get 35, 45 people for a meeting. We think we're doing well. So this is really exciting to see that everyone comes out. I'm assuming you're coming for the food, but it still makes me feel good at any rate. I would encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to turn your phones to vibrate. I'm sure sometimes you forget to do that like I do, but just to encourage you to do that. The other thing I would like to encourage you to do is, as we go through, jot down any notes on the Bright Ideas page you have on the back of your materials, because that's going to be your resource to go back and maybe think of other questions or talk to other people about something you might have heard today that you want to explore a little bit further. With that in mind, I'd like to get started. I'm not going to bore you with the details of my life because you have a little biography in your materials there. It's probably more than you'll ever want to know about Bob Lucas. However, if you have an overwhelming desire to find out more, I'd love to talk about myself, so I'll meet you in the back of the room after this is over. We can chat all day long. But with that, I'll drop that topic and move on to what we're here to talk about today, which is tapping the brain for learning. And this is normally done in a 1 to 2 day workshop, so you're getting like the super condensed version, so bear with me. I'm going to hit on a couple highlights of things, and then we're going to have an opportunity to do a small activity at your table, but with 55 minutes we've kind of limited to what we can do, and I know you understand that as trainers. So I'm not going to overwhelm you with slides. Most of what is on the slides is going to be in your materials, so you don't have to worry about taking a lot of notes. If you feel free to jot down anything you like as we go along, though, as I said earlier. To get us started, if I could have everyone just put down your forks for a second. I know that's great food, but if you put down your forks, stand up for just a quick second. What I'd like for you to do is spread your palms facing one another about shoulder width apart, and I'm going to ask you to bring them together as loudly as you can, and then increase the pace. Do that 5 times, okay? If you go ahead and start with once and then continue. All right, thank you. Have a seat, please. I just wanted to make sure that I can go back and tell my wife that I got a standing ovation today, so I appreciate your participation in that way, and I have video proof that that's happening. Let's talk a little bit about what brain-based learning is as we go through this morning, and talk about some of the ways you can incorporate some of these basic strategies into what you do. One of the things that you probably have heard over the years is that the mind can absorb a lot of information. And one of the things we know from research is that it is very dynamic. It can absorb a lot of data. It can process a lot of things, assimilate new data into what you already know from your memories. So it's a very dynamic organ. And one of the things that I usually encourage you to think about is that once the brain gathers new knowledge, it never goes back. And it's kind of like this little device here. Once it goes out to a different size, it doesn't go back to its normal shape or its normal configuration, because you have new memories that you store in various parts of your brain. It has new data it can extract and pull from as you need it from that point on, unless of course you have some sort of brain injury or you have some other issue that comes into play there. Typically that's the way the brain functions. So in a nutshell, you're now mini neuroscientists, okay? So I'm going to certify you as you go out of the room, and you can say, I am a neuroscientist, thank you very much for asking. But the real thing to take away from that is that our goal up here is to facilitate knowledge, not to be the sage on the stage or the talking head. And I would encourage you to think about what you're currently doing or what you've seen other people do as far as delivery. Are there things that you might modify? Are there things that you might do differently that could help people better gain, retain, recall, and use what they learn? Because that's really the goal of training, isn't it, in learning and performance? To help people gain, retain, recall, and use what they learn. And so as we go through talking about some of these quick strategies, think about how could I apply those in what I do? What am I doing that maybe relates to that I can either modify or maybe add to? Someone mentioned earlier there's a technique I was going to have you participate in, but because someone had a severe latex allergy earlier, we weren't able to do that. We had to get rid of the balloons that were in the room. And I use balloons because they're an inexpensive way to add color to the environment, but they're also a great way to build in sound as well as review activity. And the way I do that is to have people extract those balloons off the wall and actually pop them, recover a strip of paper that's inside, and that strip of paper is a key concept up to that point that's been covered in the session, so it becomes a review activity where people share that with the rest of the group, and then someone else defines it. You share a reward for that effort, and so you build in a lot of different things. You build in sound, you build in the color by adding it to the room environment, you build in activity by people moving, so it builds in a lot of the elements that tie into brain-based research related to how the brain best absorbs information and is able to process it. So little things like that can be tied into any program and help you to make sure that people, again, gain, retain, recall, and use what they've learned. Now, many of you, like your learners, come to an event like this, and you probably have some preconceived ideas. Would everybody agree with that statement? And a lot of times we have preconceived ideas based on what? Our experience, yeah. So what I'd like to do with you is to share with you that creativity is really a state of mind, that each of us has perceptions of how things can work and will work. I've had people in some of the techniques that I share today, they'll say, well, that won't work for me because I do XYZ type training. And so I asked them, I said, well, how do you know it doesn't work? Well, I know my corporate culture. I know my clients. I know it just won't work. And I ask them to give me examples. And as I dive down into it, what do you think I often find? It probably would work, but what's keeping it from working? They are. They don't believe it will work, so they won't try it. And I use an example of doing some executive development training years ago, and I had directors, managing directors, VPs in the room, and at that time they were the typical scenario of white Anglo-Saxon males, and I started out my program by saying, it was a strategic planning session, and I started out the program saying, and as we go along, I'm going to put smile face stickers on your name tag for every great idea or anytime you involve something or ask a question and participate actively, I'm going to give you a sticker. Now imagine the response I got from these guys. They're looking around like, what the heck? You know, what's he doing? And so I progressively went along and gave them their stickers, and what do you think happened by the time we took our first break if I failed to put a sticker on somebody's name tag? Bob, I should get a sticker for that, right? All of a sudden they're looking around and seeing all these other people with stickers, and they don't have so many, so the competitiveness was kicking in. So you have to be careful. You don't want to be just focused on the competitiveness. You have to focus on why are you doing that. Give them a purpose for doing that. But it did work, because at the end I gave them a copy of one of my books, and they were happy because they got a free something free. And so I would encourage you to think about what are your perceptions and what might be your learners' perceptions. And to help you sort of focus on that just a little bit, I'm going to do a little activity where I share something with you related to a balloon. And we can do this now since that lady decided not to stay. I'm sorry she wasn't able to stay, but we'll go ahead and do this activity now. By the way, we learned a lesson here that is probably something pertinent to every one of you. If you're going to have people coming in and paying for an event, make sure you share with them that they have an opportunity to let you know of any specific accommodation that needs to be made. The ADA requires that. So if you're going to have people come to your event and pay for it, make sure you give them the opportunity to identify any accommodations that's needed. Otherwise, there could be some potential legal issues there. So one of the things that I would encourage you to think about is your perceptions. Now, we probably all have seen, how many people have seen one of these before? It's a balloon. Oh, look at this, hands up to ears. What is that? I haven't done anything yet. Why would you put your fingers up to your ears? Is that a perception possibly? What happens if I put a sharp object in contact with an inflated balloon? It's probably going to pop, okay? How many of you think it absolutely is going to pop? Raise your hands, please. A couple of you, okay? Some of you have seen this, obviously. Well, let's test the theory for those of you who are non-believers. Oh, yep, you're right. So your perception is correct. If we put a sharp object in contact with an inflated balloon, it's always going to pop, right? What if I could share with you an opportunity where that may not always be true? Would you be interested in hearing other things I might be able to share with you that might be contrary to your perceptions? Well, let's test out the theory and see what happens. And one of the challenges is that as trainers, we have lots of things that we do. Whoops, we almost got there. As a good trainer, you want to have what? A backup plan. But the idea behind this is that we all do come with preconceived ideas, and the challenge is, how do we make sure that our ideas do not influence the learning that's going to take place in your environment? So I'm going to use a magic wand this time to make sure this happens. Abracadabra, please make this work, because I'll look stupid otherwise. And again, we have to make sure that we have opportunities for people to see things, to believe them. And there are some times where if you see it, it becomes part of your memory, doesn't it? You start to recognize that, oh, that's not too bad. So make sure this is not a magic balloon. It does indeed pop. Now, how could you use something like that in your own workshops, in your own training programs, in your own learning events? What could you do with something like that?
Challenge assumptions.
I'm sorry? Challenge them?
Challenge assumptions.
Challenge assumptions, okay, just as I've done. Okay, what else could you do? Somebody else had their hand up.
Same thing.
Same thing, okay. Could you do anything else with that?
Wake up your audience.
You could wake up your audience, absolutely. How many of you as kids were fascinated with magic? Yeah. Again, adults are just kids with big bodies. We learn behaviors as children, we repeat them as adults. So if you can take people back to a point that they had pleasurable experiences, probably the brain is going to open up and be more receptive to ideas, to things that you're going to be sharing with them. So again, look for ways to build in simple things like magic or balloons or color or other elements that we know stimulate brain neurons into what you do as your facilitation. Because it doesn't always have to be the same thing. An analogy I often give is, how many of you do orientation training? Okay, a number of you. Do you do the same activities each time that you have an orientation group? I'm seeing the heads go, yep.
From year to year.
Change from year to year? Okay, well that's good. I would encourage you to change every time you do it. And by change, I mean if you're doing an introductory activity. Now here's one I know none of you have ever done, but I've seen it done many times before, where new people you're asked to turn to one another, share 3 things about themselves, and then stand up and do what? Introduce their new friend, right? Well, it's a valid activity, it works, but guess what? It's been around for about 150 years now, so that's as long as I've been doing training. So I know that there's probably other things out there you could do differently. So I encourage you to go on the internet, type in introduction or icebreaker activities, buy a book, do something, but come up with a different alternative. Because what happens if you introduce a new activity each time? What's going to happen from your perspective?
Keeps it fresh.
It's going to keep it fresh. If you're alert, if you're focused, if you have to stop and think, okay, what's the next thing I have to do? Then chances are it's going to be fresh for you, it's going to be fresh for your learners and your audience in that case. So look for ways to build in some randomness, some change into your own learning events, because that's the thing that's going to help you be better at what you do in sharing their ideas, to help them gain, retain, recall, and use what they've learned. You want that to be the ultimate outcome. So think about things that you're doing currently, think about things that you might do differently, and focus on making those things happen. So when you go through the process of learning, first of all, how many of you have heard of brain-based learning before? I keep throwing that term out. I see a lot of hands not up. On your Bright Ideas page, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, write down brain-based learning, do some research, and when you leave this room, go and type in that term on Google or whatever search engine you use, because there's so much fascinating information out there about how the brain processes information. We've learned so much over the years that it really is going to help you in your future efforts as a facilitator, but it's also going to help your learners, because you're going to be able to do things that will energize them, stimulate those brain neurons, and get those synapses in their brain firing and connecting, so that ultimately they walk out of there with better knowledge and skills, or at least enhanced knowledge and skills, and they can go back and start applying what they've learned. And that's your goal again. So look for ways to build these things into what you do. And the way you do that is by finding out more about it. So let's delve into this just a bit. What is brain-based learning? Those of you that have been in the field for more than a couple decades may remember that back in the 1990s, the federal government under George W. Bush, it gave a lot of research dollars to psychologists and neuropsychologists and scientists, so they could find out more about the brain functioning. They went in to find out, how do we, if we introduce a stimuli, visual, auditory stimuli, any sensory stimuli, what is that doing in the brain? And the wonderful part about it is, with the new medical technology we have available, the MRIs, the PET scans, and all those other devices that are out there, they can physically look into the brain in a real-time situation. When they introduce a smell, what part of the brain is firing? When they introduce a visual item, what brain functions are happening up there? So now we know what's going on in the brain. And that helps us as facilitators. How does that help us?
Make sure you don't wear out one part of your brain.
Make sure you don't wear out one side of the brain. But you're not far off track. We have three modalities primarily that people gain information from, correct? They are what? Visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. So you're actually absolutely right. We don't want to wear out one side, part of the brain, but more than wearing it out, we don't want to drive everything to that one area of the brain. We want to introduce things, because the more senses you can involve in the learning, the more likely that learning is going to take place, the more memories that are going to be formed. Think of all the things that you remember and why they're important to you. You typically remember things that were painful or things that were very joyful in your life, way into your older age. And as a learner, if we can build in elements that tie into the visual, auditory, kinesthetic on a regular basis, pull in those different elements through activity or through the way we do things, then your learner is going to be able to potentially absorb more. We often, going back to our preferences that I talked about earlier, we often facilitate from our primary style, don't we, or our primary preference. How many of you are visual learners in here? You get your most information best through visual? Okay, a lot of you, okay, which is typical. A large percentage of the population are visual learners. How about auditory learners? How many auditory learners we got in here? One? Wow, how about a shut up then? Two, okay, she had to think about that, okay. How about your kinesthetic learners? You learn by doing. A lot of you, yeah. And most of us have primary and secondary styles. I'm a visual kinesthetic learner. So I have to see it and then actually do it before I get maximum learning to take place. If you can at all, as part of your needs assessment, is before you go into a room with a group, ask that kind of question. Are they visual, auditory, kinesthetic? That gives you an idea of how much effort to put in different areas. But mix them up. You might do a visual activity, a kinesthetic activity, an auditory activity, then you might go back and do something else. You might do two of one type back to back. It doesn't matter, just so you hit them all regularly throughout your time that you have with that group. So the decade of the brain, back to the 1990s, we learned so much about the brain. We learned more in that decade than we probably learned in the previous 100 years about the brain. So that's why they call it decade of the brain. And one of the big things we learned is that the brain is very complex. It's very functional, but it also has a lot of different little twists and turns in there. And the way that it processes information is different for each person. We continue to learn into our older age. Before that, we believe that as you got older, you start losing gray matter. And the reality is that we now know that you continue to learn until the day you die unless you have a brain abnormality or something goes on in the brain that creates a blockage. So look for ways to build in opportunities for your learners to gain that information and to look into new ways of applying that information. How many of you are familiar with brain dominance, left-right brain? Heard that theory before? Been around for decades and decades, and you have some materials in your handouts there. I'm not going to go into detail on them, but left brain tends to do what? What does the left side control? Very logical, linear, analytical, yeah, and it controls things like words and controls things that are very functional for the most part. How about the right side of the brain? What do we attribute to that? Creativity, you musicians, your artists, the people who think abstractly, the people who look outside the box and really are able to see something, pull all the pieces together. They're great with the jigsaw puzzles and those type of things because they can see it and they can envision what all those pieces are going to look like someday. So with that in mind, recognize that you've got to create a more holistic approach to your learning environment. You've got to create an opportunity where people are pulling from left side and right side, because that's really what we do. If you think about a musician who's composing a song, they have to pull from the left side of the brain to do what?
The document.
The document sides, the words, they're pulling context from that side, aren't they? They're pulling from the right side of their brain, and I'm holding my right hand up against my right side, but the right side of the brain is, they're pulling what in? How to put those words together, how to create a message with those words. They envision what they want people to hear or what they want to share with those people, so they're pulling from the left side to get the words to say it, but they're putting it over here and they're putting it all together into this visual picture. They're painting this image with them. And for example, if I were to tell you about a trip I just made to Alaska, and I said something like, I went up there and it was cold, it was pretty though. We had a lot of opportunity to take some nice pictures, and we saw a couple animals. What description is that? It's kind of left-brained, isn't it? I'm stating facts. Those are the things up there. How about if I say, you know, one of the fascinating parts, we were on a cruise ship, and it was phenomenal because as we were coasting through that frigid water with the icebergs floating there, and we looked out and we saw those white caps on the sides of the mountains on both sides of us, and we could feel the chill in the air, and the sky was just, it was just pristine. It was so clear. Is that a different image? So now I'm pulling from what side of the brain to describe that? The right side. So we use both sides of the brains, and we now know that by creating an environment that helps people open up and experience through the senses, not just hear the words through talking, that we can have an opportunity for them to come through that sensory enjoyment, if you will, and to really start to figure out what is the ultimate opportunity to use this information.